In the winter of 1887, Montana lay deep in a long winter's sleep, draped in a thick, pristine white blanket of snow. Every towering pine, every bare branch was adorned with shimmering ice crystals, transforming the forest into a silent kingdom, where only the wind whistled through the gaps in the leaves like an endless whisper, and the dry branches snapped under the ever-increasing weight of the ice. Amidst this vast coldness, a solitary wooden cabin nestled deep within the forest, like a tiny speck of isolated life, a lonely heart still beating in the dead sea of snow and ice. Inside the cabin, Elijah McGraw, 35 years old, was a man whose every facial line, every gesture was shaped by pain and loss. He had built this house with his own hands, every plank of wood, every stone laid in the fireplace, every window frame bearing the mark of his touch, and more than that, bearing the mark of a broken promise. He had once dreamed of a home where the laughter of Sarah, his beloved wife, would echo. But Sarah was gone. The cruel illness of the wild lands had taken her, leaving Elijah with an unfillable void, a cold ember in his chest that no fire could warm. He no longer wished to live. He merely existed. His days passed in a series of lifeless routines, repetitive, like an old machine. Early in the morning, he would wake before dawn, when the air in the cabin was still thick with cold and the smell of old wood. He would light the fire, the crackling of the logs the only sound breaking the ancient silence. He brewed strong black coffee, its bitter taste like his own life. After that, he would sit by the window, gazing out, where the snow continued to fall, blurring all traces of the outside world, as if trying to erase even the painful memories. Elijah was a quiet, withdrawn man. Pain had turned him into a shadow, a wandering figure amidst the wooden walls. He spoke very little, even to himself. His only conversations were with the ghosts in his mind. Memories of Sarah, her clear laughter when they gathered wild berries together, the sparkling in her eyes when they dreamed of a future on this land, or the warmth of her hand when they walked under the moonlight. He lived alone in the forest, avoiding all towns, all people. Isolation was a choice, a wall he built to protect himself from any further harm. He didn't want to feel, didn't want to hope, because hope always came with the fear of loss. On the old wooden table, a small picture frame leaned, its glass blurred with time. In the photo was Sarah, with a gentle smile and eyes sparkling with life. Elijah often looked at that picture for hours on end, as if trying to find a glimmer of light, an answer to the emptiness within him. He remembered the day Sarah told him about her illness, her voice weak but her eyes still full of love. He remembered the chilling cold of her hand when he held it for the last time. Each time he looked at the picture, the pain resurfaced, as fresh as yesterday. But only silence answered, and the wind whistled through the gaps in the cabin walls, like a whisper from the past, constantly reminding him of the irreversible loss. He hunted, not for pleasure or adventure, but out of necessity. His hunting knife was sharp, but his eyes were lifeless, no longer gleaming with the passion of a true hunter. He trapped animals, chopped wood, did everything mechanically, as if it were part of a ritual of existence. His calloused hands were accustomed to hard labor, but they no longer felt the warmth of a touch or the softness of hair. They only knew how to grasp, drag, and endure that at night. He sat by the fireplace, watching the fire dance. The orange-yellow light cast shadows on his haggard face, highlighting his weary features and deep-set eyes, which held an unfathomable sorrow. He didn't read books, didn't write letters. His world was confined within 4 wooden walls, the howling wind outside, and the ceaseless haunting memories. This cabin, which was supposed to be a home of happiness, had now become a prison of pain, a place where he confined himself. On the wooden beam above the door, he had carved the words, "For the gone, for the departed." It was a constant reminder of his loss, a declaration of his surrender to life, a vow to live forever in the past. The air in the cabin was always cold, no matter how warm the fireplace burned. That coldness didn't come from outside, but from deep within Elijah. It permeated every object, every hidden corner, turning the house into a museum of sorrow where everything was frozen in time. He had once tried to plant some of Sarah's favorite seeds in an old pot, but they didn't sprout. Like the hope in his heart, they had died with the eternal winter in his soul. One late winter afternoon, when the snow fell heavier than ever, large snowflakes like swirling white petals in the air, an event occurred that broke the cruel monotony of Elijah's life. He was sitting by the fireplace, sharpening his hunting knife, the rhythmic scraping of metal against stone like the slow beat of a hardened heart. Suddenly, a strange sound came from outside. It wasn't the wind whistling through a crack, nor the breaking of branches under the weight of ice. It was a heavy thud, as if something had collapsed, followed by a faint whimper, almost swallowed by the wind. Elijah stopped. He listened. The stillness of the forest had taught him to discern every sound, no matter how small, to distinguish between natural noises and anomalies. Another sound, fainter, unmistakable. He put down his knife, reached for the old rifle leaning against the fireplace, feeling the coldness of the metal in his hand. He stepped to the door, cautiously opening it just enough to peer outside. Cold wind slapped his face, carrying tiny snowflakes like thousands of needles, making him shiver. In front of the cabin door, amidst the swirling white snow, a figure lay motionless. A woman. Her small body was almost swallowed by the snow. Elijah's heart, which he thought had frozen and hardened, suddenly skipped a beat, a sensation he believed he would never feel again. He hesitated for a moment, caught between the deep caution of a solitary man and a flicker of human instinct that had long been dormant, a call from deep within him. He lowered his rifle, stepped quickly outside, his feet sinking deep into the snow. The girl lay face down in the snow, her dark brown hair matted with ice, clinging to her face. Her thin coat was soaked through, insufficient to withstand Montana's biting cold. Elijah knelt, his calloused hands trembling as he gently turned her over. Her face was pale, her lips blue, almost devoid of color. Her breath was faint, almost inaudible, just a thin wisp of vapor escaping her nose. She had collapsed from cold and hunger, just steps from the cabin door, as if fate had led her here. Josie Wynn, 28 years old, was on the run. Her life had been a series of impositions, from minor decisions to major choices. And this arranged marriage, to a man she didn't love, was the last straw, a final tightening rope she could no longer bear. She had left everything behind, venturing alone into the cold winter, hoping to find freedom, even if the price was her life. She had walked for days, traversing snow-covered trails, sometimes lost, sometimes collapsing, with only a little dried food and an iron will. She had fought against the cold, against hunger, against fear. But will could not withstand the bone-chilling cold and the body's exhaustion. She had fallen, and darkness swallowed her. Elijah lifted the girl. Her body was light, cold as a block of ice. He carried her into the cabin, placing her on the only bed near the fireplace where warmth radiated. He quickly removed her soaked coat, replacing it with a thick, warm wool blanket. He added more wood to the fire, and the flames flared up, dispelling some of the biting cold that clung to the room. He looked at the girl. Her face, though pale, still exuded a strong will, a resilient spirit hidden deep within, but her furrowed brows in her unconscious sleep showed deep wounds, invisible scars left by life. He didn't know who she was, where she came from, or why she had collapsed at his doorstep. But one thing he knew for sure: she needed help. A strange sense of responsibility arose within him. He boiled water, brewed a hot cup of herbal tea, its gentle aroma spreading through the air. He gently supported her head, bringing the cup to her lips. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from a strange sensation that had long been absent: worry, concern for another living being. Josie groaned softly, her eyes slowly opening, her first glance filled with disorientation, then deep caution. She looked at Elijah, a strange man with a thick beard and dark, weary eyes. She tried to pull back, but her body was too weak to move. "You're safe," Elijah said, his voice hoarse from disuse, like stone grinding against stone. "Just rest." Josie didn't answer. She just looked at him, her eyes as wary as a wounded animal cornered. She was accustomed to danger, accustomed to having to protect herself. Kindness to her often came with a price, an unspoken exchange she always had to be wary of. She closed her eyes, trying to retreat within herself, but the warmth from the blanket and the scent of herbal tea still seeped into her senses. The following days passed in a heavy silence, a silence woven from the individual pains of each person. Two strangers, each carrying their own burden, lived together under one roof, like two lonely stones carried by the river of life for the same shore. Josie recovered slowly, little by little. She was still weak, but her will to live, her will for freedom, helped her through. She didn't speak much, responding only with nods or shakes of her head, sometimes a soft sigh. Elijah was the same. He maintained his routine, hunting, chopping wood, tending the fireplace. He left food for her on the table, a hot bowl of porridge, a piece of dried meat. He didn't force her to talk, didn't ask about her past, didn't touch the emotional wounds he sensed within her. He understood the need for space and privacy, for he himself lived in a private space of pain. The air in the cabin was still cold, but no longer the cold of complete emptiness. Now there was another presence, another breath. Josie often sat by the window, looking out, where the snow continued to fall, the pure white flakes like unspoken thoughts. Sometimes she caught Elijah's gaze. He would quickly turn away, as if afraid of some connection, an invisible thread that might pull him out of his safe shell. One evening, when the light from the fireplace was the only source of illumination. In the cabin, Elijah was sitting by the fireplace, reading an old book, its pages yellowed with time. Josie, sitting opposite him, suddenly coughed, a dry, hacking cough that broke the stillness. Elijah looked up at her. He saw her huddled in the blanket, her lips still slightly pale, her eyes weary. He stood up, went into the kitchen, without a word, and heated a pot of hot soup. The aroma of the soup spread through the air, dispelling the smell of old wood and the cold. He placed the bowl of soup in front of her. The steam from the soup rose, warming her face, melting the layer of ice on her skin. Josie looked at the soup, then at Elijah. A complex gaze, both wary and with a hint of gratitude, a glimmer of light in her tired eyes. She took the bowl, her hands trembling, slowly sipping each spoonful, feeling the warmth spread through her body. It was the first bowl of soup she had received from a stranger without any conditions, without any demands. Small actions gradually changed the atmosphere in the cabin. Elijah no longer slammed the door when he went out. He left some dry wood next to the fireplace for Josie, ensuring she could stay warm in his absence. Josie, though still cautious, also began to reciprocate with small actions. She folded the blankets neatly, swept the floor, tidied up the scattered items. Once, when Elijah returned from the forest, his shoulders covered in snow, she had already started a fire in the fireplace, the flickering flames welcoming him, dispelling the cold and his weariness. Trust was built little by little, through unspoken actions, through small but meaningful gestures. They didn't talk about the past, didn't talk about the future. They simply lived in the present, sharing space, sharing silence, and gradually, sharing each other's presence. Elijah still often looked at Sarah's picture frame. Josie noticed this too. She didn't ask, didn't comment. She understood that everyone had their own ghosts, their own burdens to carry. Once, when Elijah was dozing by the fireplace, the old book resting on his chest, Josie walked closer to the picture frame. She looked at Sarah's face, a beautiful woman with a gentle smile. Then at Elijah, the man sleeping soundly, his face showing weariness, but also a hint of peace. A quiet empathy arose, an understanding that needed no words, the wind whistling. Through the cabin walls continued, like a mournful song of winter, but now it was no longer alone. There was the crackling of logs, the clinking of a spoon against a bowl, the soft footsteps on the wooden floor, the popping of embers in the fireplace. The cabin, once a place of isolation, now had another warmth, another life, a new rhythm. One morning, Elijah was eating his breakfast, the slow chewing echoing in the space. Josie approached, placing a handkerchief embroidered with simple but intricate patterns on the table. It was her handkerchief, clean and neatly folded, carrying the scent of soap and meticulous care. Elijah looked at the handkerchief, then at her. Josie just nodded slightly, a small smile fleeting across her lips, like a thank you, a response to his kindness. It was the first time she had actively given him something, a small but meaningful gift. Elijah took the handkerchief, feeling the softness of the fabric, the warmth from her hand still lingering. A warm feeling spread within him, a feeling he thought he would never experience again. He quietly folded the handkerchief and put it in his coat pocket. Internal conflict began to seep into both of them, like melting snowflakes soaking deep into the earth. Josie was afraid of owing anyone anything. Her life had taught her that every help came with a price, an invisible thread that would bind her. She feared commitment, feared having to depend on others. She had fled to find freedom, to decide her own destiny, and now, the warmth of this cabin, Elijah's quiet kindness, made her feel trapped, caught between the desire for safety and the fear of losing her freedom. She began to think about leaving, even though it was still harsh winter outside. Even though she didn't know where she would go. Elijah felt the same. He was afraid of losing again. The pain of losing Sarah was still too deep, too haunting, like a wound that would never heal. He had told himself he would never open his heart to anyone again, never allow himself to feel attachment, because attachment always led to pain when parting. Josie's presence, though quiet, was shaking the wall he had built over the years. He feared attachment, feared witnessing another departure, another pain that would tear him apart. One evening, the snow fell heavily, covering everything in a white blanket, turning the outside world into a monochrome painting. Elijah and Josie sat by the fireplace, the flames flickering, casting dancing shadows on the walls, creating a dance of light and shadow. No one spoke a word. But in that silence, there was an invisible connection, an emotional thread slowly being woven. The light from their shared fire had dispelled some of the darkness in their souls, bringing a little peace. Josie looked at the fire, the sparks dancing in her eyes, then at Elijah. He was staring at the fire, his eyes no longer lifeless as before. There was a glimmer of light in them, a glimmer of life, of presence. She realized that this cabin, though simple, had become a safe haven for her, a place where she could finally breathe a sigh of relief after days of running. And this man, though quiet, had given her a warmth she had lost long ago, a silent comfort. She remembered the first night she woke up in the cabin, when Elijah gave her the warm tea. His hands trembled, but his gaze was steady, without judgment or demand. She had been wary of kindness, but Elijah's kindness was a kindness that asked for nothing, judged nothing, a pure kindness. Elijah also felt the change. Josie's presence had made the cabin less cold. Her laughter, though rare, was like a warm breeze blowing through his soul, melting the layer of ice. He began to realize that living in the past only caused him more suffering, only kept him trapped in an endless loop of sorrow. Perhaps it was time for him to look forward. It was time for him to allow himself to feel again, One afternoon, when a sudden snowstorm hit, the wind howled like wolves, and the snow fell so thick that nothing could be seen outside the window. The lights in the cabin flickered and then went out. Elijah quickly checked the fireplace, making sure there was enough wood. Josie, without a word, took out the oil lamp, lit it, and placed it on the table. The faint light of the oil lamp created an unusually cozy atmosphere. They sat together, listening to the storm raging outside, feeling the closeness in that moment. Their mutual dependence during the storm broke down another invisible barrier between them. One morning, as the weak winter sun shone through the window, melting the ice crystals on the glass, Josie made her decision. She had fully recovered, her body had regained its strength, and her spirit was firmer. It was time for her to continue her journey. She didn't want to owe Elijah anything, and she also feared the attachment that was slowly growing between them. She was afraid that if she stayed, she would be trapped again, losing the freedom she had risked her life to find. She packed her belongings, just a few simple things she had brought with her when she fled, now clean and tidy. Elijah watched her, his eyes revealing his inner struggle. He knew she was leaving. He wanted to keep her, wanted to say the words he had kept silent for so long. But the fear of loss was too great. It weighed heavily on his chest, making him unable to speak. He was afraid that if he kept her, and then she left again, the pain would be even greater than before. It would tear him apart. He was afraid he would sink back into emptiness, an emptiness even worse than before. "Where are you going?" Elijah asked, his voice hoarse, weak as the wind. "I don't know," Josie replied, her voice also trembling slightly, her eyes looking directly at him, searching for something, a sign. "It's just ... I have to go. I can't stay." Elijah nodded. He didn't try to stop her. He didn't say another word. He just stood there, watching her, his eyes full of helplessness and sorrow. Josie turned and walked away, opening the cabin door. The cold wind rushed in, carrying the scent of snow and loneliness, like a reminder of the harsh world outside. She stepped out, her feet heavy in the thick snow. Each step a struggle within her heart. Elijah watched her figure disappear into the white snow, like a fading dream. A sense of emptiness returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the emptiness of old pain, the pain of irreversible loss. Instead, it was the emptiness of a lost opportunity, a future that could have been different. He realized that Josie's presence had brought him something he had lost long ago: hope, a tiny glimmer of light in his life. He had been too afraid to hold on to it. Josie walked on. She went quite a distance, far enough for the cabin to be just a small dot behind her, almost swallowed by the vast white landscape. The cold wind still whistled, the snow still fell, tiny snowflakes clinging to her eyelashes. She felt the cold seep into her bones, but this time it was no longer the cold of despair, but the cold of loneliness. She stopped, turned her head to look back at the cabin, where the faint light of the fireplace still flickered. She remembered her days there. She remembered the hot soup, the flickering fire in the fireplace, the handkerchief she had left on the table, the warmth of the wool blanket Elijah had given her. She remembered Elijah's eyes, unspoken, but filled with care, with selfless kindness. She realized that the cabin was no longer cold, not because of the fireplace, but because something had changed within her. She had found a refuge, not just for her body, but for her soul, a place where she could be herself without having to be wary. She had found a man who had given her kindness without asking for anything in return, a man who also carried his own wounds. Josie turned back. She ran towards the cabin, her steps faster, more determined, as if racing against time, against her own fear. Elijah was still standing there, by the window, looking out, his gaze still following the direction she had gone. He saw her figure reappear, running towards him, an unbelievable sight. A spark lit up in his eyes, a spark of hope, of relief, Josie entered the cabin. Breathless, her breath forming white clouds in the cold air. She looked at Elijah, her eyes sparkling, no longer wary but filled with sincerity. "I can't go," she sighed, her voice trembling slightly but full of resolve. "This cabin ... it's not cold anymore, and neither am I." Elijah said nothing. He just nodded slightly, a small, very small smile spreading across his lips, revealing the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. It was the first time he had smiled in many years, a smile that carried liberation, acceptance. In the days that followed, the cabin truly transformed, like a snowflake melting and blooming under the sun. No longer a place of solitude and sorrow, it had become a true home, a place of life and hope. Josie embroidered new handkerchiefs with vibrant patterns of summer wildflowers, placing them on the table, on the shelves, bringing color and life to the house. She also found some old flower seeds in a jar, and with meticulous care, she planted them in small pots. Even in the middle of winter, the first green shoots began to emerge, carrying a promise of spring. She also started to rearrange the kitchen, making it a cozier and more functional space. The smell of freshly baked bread, of hot soup, often permeated the air, replacing the scent of old wood and cold. Elijah no longer sat for hours looking at Sarah's picture frame. He still remembered her, but the pain no longer haunted him as before. One afternoon, he gently placed the picture frame in an old wooden box, putting it in a hidden corner of the cupboard. It was not forgetfulness, but acceptance, a sign that he was ready to move on. Sarah would forever be in his heart, but his life needed to continue, needed new chapters. The cabin door was no longer kept closed. Sometimes Elijah would open it slightly, allowing the weak winter sunlight to stream in, allowing the fresh mountain air to dispel the gloom. He and Josie still didn't speak much, but their glances, their smiles, their small actions had replaced words, creating a unique language of understanding. They chopped wood together, prepared meals together, sat by the fireplace together in comfortable silence. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, the fire blazing, Elijah looked up at the wooden beam above the door. The words "for the gone" were still there, but now they no longer fit. They no longer represented his life. He took his hunting knife, and next to the old inscription, he began to carve more. Each stroke slow, careful, as if writing a new vow. Josie watched him, not asking, but she understood. When he finished, Josie stepped closer, gently touching the newly carved words. Next to "for the gone," there were now new words, clear and meaningful. For the living, for the living. It was a declaration of rebirth, of a future no longer bound by the past. The cabin was no longer cold. It had been warmed by a new fire, a fire of hope, of connection, and of love that was slowly blossoming. Elijah and Josie, two people once wounded, once living in solitude, had found each other in the cold winter of Montana, and together they had begun a new chapter in their lives, a chapter written with warmth, understanding, and the faint glimmers of a future no longer solitary. They looked out the window where the snow had begun to melt, the glistening drops of water signaling the arrival of spring, bringing with it a promise of new beginnings.